I'm sure I've said in the past, but considering how much of my reading is fantasy and how much of a fantasy lover I am, I really struggle with its genre cousin, sci-fi. There are plenty of sci-fi books with really interesting sounding plots, really fascinating premises, but I don't know that I have ever really come out of a sci-fi book and thought that was a 5-star read. In recent years, there has been a slight trend towards cozy sci-fi, towards romantic sci-fi, and those have been much better fits for me. But every year when Sci-Fi Month runs in November, I always try and take part because it pushes me to try some of those books that I've put on my TBR and set aside again and again because I know I'm going to struggle with sci-fi. So this is really the perfect chance for me to get some of those books off my shelf, but also to really take part in the community that the 4 hosts put together during this month. It's a very low stakes readathon, there's no competitive aspect, there's no prompts, you can read as much or as little as you want, and you can read the type of sci-fi that appeals to you. However, they do have lots of Instagram prompt challenges, they have some blog ideas for you to kind of riff off of, and they usually have a read-along, but I don't think I'm going to take part in that one this year. The blogs that are running the readathon are A Dance with Books, Dear Geek Place, Always Room for One More, and Book Forager. And I will link to all of their blogs down in the description. For my own personal reading choices, I narrowed it into about 6 books. And I've now narrowed it down to 3 that I think I'm going to read in this vlog. There are a few others I would like to get to that are maybe more on that borderline, that genre blend between sci-fi and fantasy, but the ones I really want to prioritise are the ones that are solidly science fiction. So that being said, the first one that I want to pick up is, I guess, a historical science fiction by way of a retelling, and this is The Shocking Experiments of Mary Bennet by Melissa Taub. I read Melissa Taub's other Pride and Prejudice retelling back in July for Jane Austen July, and I took that with me to Bath and I had a really good time with it. It turned out that the book wasn't set in Bath, but I did go to the Jane Austen house. I did get to see the Royal Crescent, and it was fun to be doing all that sightseeing while reading a book that was inspired by Jane Austen. That one was The Scandalous Confessions of Lydia Bennet, Witch. So obviously we followed Lydia, and she was a witch, and it had to do with her making a devil's bargain with Wickham. It was told in a dual timeline, and I did have some issues with the voiciness of the character, but I have really high hopes for this one. Mary is overlooked so much in the novel that I think she opens up some really good opportunities, especially for modern writers, where a lot of Mary's flaws are things that as a modern reader we can maybe understand a lot better, we can see more in ourselves. Her love of books, her social awkwardness, maybe those are things that we as readers don't mind as much. I'll get started on the book and I will let you know how it goes. So I've reached about the midpoint of The Shocking Experiments of Miss Mary Bennet, and I'm having a really good time with it. I think the writing style doesn't feel quite as rich, quite as deep as the other Melissa Taub book that I read. This one, it feels more YA, it feels easier read, but I'm still enjoying that. So far we have almost entirely been focused on Mary. Her mother, her father, there have been some little cameos from the other Pride and Prejudice characters, but we are very much following Mary. We followed her through some of the events of Pride and Prejudice, and we're now sitting after the book has finished. We've seen Mary's struggle with socialising, we've seen her struggle with being an intellectual, especially in a family where her older sisters are lauded, especially Lizzie, for her intelligence. She's very smart, but she doesn't have that easy way about her that Lizzie has. She's not as easily likeable as Jane, and she's not as fun as Lydia or Kitty, so she sits awkwardly in the middle. Her father doesn't think she's smart enough to keep up with him, even though she very clearly is, and her mother thinks she's too smart for her own good. So far, there are elements of the mad scientist angle, there are elements of reanimating the dead, but it's not as much of a Frankenstein retelling as I thought. It's very much just pulling that idea out. I do think that these characters feel believably like the characters from Pride and Prejudice. And the setting, which is really vividly painted, we get to see lots of Meryton, the little town that's in Pride and Prejudice, and a little bit of Longbourn. It definitely feels like we're in that world, but that's been married together with those elements from Frankenstein. So we have Mary as a scientist. We talk a little bit about the scientific changes that are occurring in this time period and how Mary might or might not have been or be able to get involved with that. We see her struggling to prove her worth as an intellect and as a scientist, as a woman, especially a young woman. And we see how that desire to prove herself makes her push maybe further than she should, makes her maybe too ambitious. She isn't thinking things through entirely, and she makes mistakes. She makes errors in judgment that obviously lead us into the creation of that Frankenstein-esque character. And I think that's really nice because I do think it feels believable for Mary as a character in Pride and Prejudice, but it also just feels like a really believable plot arc for a woman in this time period if this were a completely original story. I think it was a great one to start with. The science element is quite strong in it. I wasn't sure whether it would be or not. I wasn't sure if this might just be a veneer on top of the rest of the retelling, but I do think the science aspect feels integral to the plot, so it fits well with Science Fiction Month without it being a really hardcore space set science fiction. This has been a nice one just to ease me in. I finished The Shocking Experiments of Mary Bennet and I had a great time with this book. I don't think it's going to be a 5-star. I don't think it quite got there for me, but I do think it was a really nice way to start off this vlog, to start off Sci-Fi Month with something that feels more for me like where I come into the sci-fi realm. Something I'm more comfortable with, that alternate history, that Frankenstein inspiration, the medical science that borders on the preternatural. I'm a big Frankenstein fan. It is my favourite classic, and so I think that really helped me here. Taub has done something really smart with this book, and that is the character of Mary as our Victor-like protagonist. I did say I'm a fan of Frankenstein, but I will be honest, I'm a fan of Frankenstein that fully accepts that Victor is the worst person in the world. And I think that's the point of Frankenstein. But it does leave us with a protagonist that isn't always super enjoyable, isn't super likeable. It leaves us that moral quandary over who is the real monster. And sometimes you don't want that. And I think that's what Taub gives us in this. We're getting a protagonist in the form of Mary, who is a protagonist you can really root for. And that simple change is caused literally in the nature of her as a character from Pride and Prejudice. Now, obviously the two original books do have different time settings. We have the Regency and the Victorian era. But in terms of us as modern readers and some of the social circumstances that are relevant to Mary in this one, it kind of doesn't matter, it works. In Frankenstein we have a wealthy student, and the creation of the monster is by and large to do with hubris and ego. It's to do with the selfishness of leaving your creation behind. On the part of the monster we have that internal rage, that push for justice, railing against what you see as inequalities. And I think Taub has managed to take both those elements and combine them with the Mary we know from Pride and Prejudice to create something that feels complex but also understandable. She's not a wealthy student doing this because she wants to see how far she can push knowledge, how far she can push herself. She's a woman in this time period, so obviously her options are far more constrained. She's not just a woman, but she's a very intelligent, scientifically minded woman in a family specifically that are constantly telling her that that is something she shouldn't want to be. We see Mary struggle to earn herself an education, to earn herself the right to look into the scientific community, scientific writing, and she is constantly not only told that she isn't good enough to do that, but when she does have minor successes, they are snatched from her hands by men who are quite often less intelligent and less capable than she is. You can see, even from the start, even from her early childhood, where this sense of the injustice of it comes from. As the story progresses, we see her make more and more mistakes. We see her forge forward with all of these red flags raised, but continue on anyway, despite the fact that we can clearly see something is going to go wrong. And it doesn't feel like that hubris we see in Victor, because it feels so justified. Mary is struggling to gain any sense of freedom, of independence, of power. And you can then understand why she's so unwilling, unaccepting of having that taken from her, that she will continue to make these mistakes, that she will make bigger mistakes. The reader can see this tragic path she's going down, but you can see why she's not quite willing to give up. You can see why she would dig her heels in until the bitter end. That just made her so relatable and so understandable. It obviously would work with any scholarly female in this era, but you get the added nuance from Pride and Prejudice that specifically this is a Bennet sister, a woman who has consistently her whole life been aware of the fact that she is lesser than a man. She has not got as many rights as a man. Her family home will literally be taken from them just because her parents didn't have a son. Specifically, she's Mary, who is the middle child, the overlooked child, and she is constantly again told that she is lesser than because she's not as fun as her younger sisters or as charming as her older sisters. She sits in that middle ground where no one really seems to like her, to want her, and you can definitely see why when she creates this creature that is devoted to her, at least in the beginning, she's so determined not to let that go. Where when she comes up with a new invention that's a viable business strategy, why she's willing to cut corners and look the other way as the business progresses, because she needs that validation, the power, the independence, the money. You can feel her dilemma. I wasn't sure how these two stories would butt up against each other, but I think that Taub has handled it really well. She keeps, by and large, the bulk of Pride and Prejudice the same. Most of this is set after the fact, but it feels believably like the characters have been the characters they were in the original. They're a little bit different, having moved on with their lives, but they're still conceivably those characters. She adds in those themes from Frankenstein, in particular the more Victorian theme of God versus man, science versus morality, creation, that type of thing that was very prevalent in the Victorian era gets pulled through into Mary's world. And she then just binds those two up with her own characters, her own plot lines, and it worked really, really well. I really did enjoy Lydia Bennet Witch when I read it, but I think this one just worked better for me. One of my issues with Lydia Bennet was it felt a little overinflated, especially having the dual timeline, the flashbacks. The story just felt like it was trying to do way too much. It didn't feel like we had the growth that I wanted from Lydia from one timeline to the next. This feels much more linear, almost simplified, but that works better. I think it was a good choice, as I said, to start this vlog. It's maybe not the most obviously science fiction book for a sci-fi month, but I think it's given me a really good start and set me on the right path for the rest of the month. Now, going into Mary Bennet, obviously I had a fair idea of what I was getting. That comp title mashup is such a strong one. The Pride and Prejudice meets Frankenstein. You kind of know exactly where it's going and it delivers. But the next book I'm going to pick up is one that I know absolutely nothing about, and that is 7 Recipes for Revolution by Ryan Rose. This one, the pitch titles are The Bear meets Attack on Titan, and while I've watched season 1 of The Bear, I know nothing about the rest of it and nothing about Attack on Titan, other than that they wear those little belts. So this one is a complete mystery to me. I think it's about cooking, although I don't know whether it's a cooking contest or a restaurant, or whether it's some kind of cooking based quest like Delicious in Dungeon. But I think there are some kaiju style monsters involved, and I'm looking forward to seeing where this falls on the sci-fi spectrum. finished 7 Recipes for Revolution and I had a really good time with this one. I don't know if it's just because I'm not usually a sci-fi reader and therefore I don't always understand the nuances of what makes sci-fi rather than a different type of fantasy. But for me, this one felt as comfortably fantasy as any other book I would personally go for. It does have the kaiju-like monsters, and I suppose there are elements of cooking technology. But for me, it definitely had a really firm, at least sci-fantasy feel to it, and I think maybe that's helped me. It's still very firmly in the wheelhouse of books that I like. It's not pushing it into that hard sci-fi with lots of actual physics and science, and that for me made it much more accessible. For the book itself, I had a couple of issues with it. The pacing towards the end, it was maybe a little drawn out and I could feel myself just starting to maybe lose steam even as all these big reveals were happening. Occasionally there were some moments where I felt the language maybe dipped a little too close to modern or real world vernacular, and it just drew away from the world that had been created. That was just a little bit jarring occasionally. But other than that, it was great. I really liked the way Rose managed to set up there being some mysteries and being some twists right at the start, but presented them in a way that the reveals didn't feel like gotchas. They were very upfront, the idea that there were things to look out for, and throughout Patrick the Butcher's story, we were given hints of what these things were. We were very clearly told there were going to be twists to come, and I thought that was really kind of expertly handled. It didn't feel like a cheap trick, and although the twists weren't what I expected, they did feel like they paid off in a really nice way. That said, there were still some things that I came out of this book wondering about. I didn't feel like I fully got answers to every question I'd had. But then I had expected this to be a standalone, and seeing that it's actually the first of at least a trilogy, if not a longer series, it does make sense that there would be some questions that carry through into the next book. Some of those might be revealed later. Some things might just have been things that slipped past me. There is a lot of world building in this. There are a lot of characters and a lot of complex issues happening behind the scenes of Patrick's own story. There's lots of political manoeuvring, lots of minutiae in the world. And I think this is one that would definitely benefit from a reread, which if I decide to continue the series, I probably will do, because I think that by the time I get around to reading a sequel, I think I would want to have this story fresher in my mind, just because there is a lot going on. Overall though, it was a really good book, a really good sci-fi find for me. Again, I don't think it quite hits a 5-star. One, because of those niggles I had with the story itself in terms of pacing and writing, but more so just in feel. It doesn't feel like a 5-star to me. I don't know what that spark that's missing is, but I just didn't get it here. Although I would probably rate this somewhere around a 4, which is still a really good rating and higher than I tend to rate science fiction, so it is still very much a success. That being said, for my next book, I've decided to pick something that is much more firmly in what I personally think of immediately as sci-fi. This is a book that's been on my TBR for absolutely ages, and I've been super excited to read. This is The Mars House by Natasha Pulley. I've really enjoyed Pulley's books in the past, and this one features some tropes that I personally just really always love in terms of the relationship angle, so I'm thinking it's probably going to be a success for me either way. And being that it's set in a climate catastrophe future and about colonists living on Mars, it's definitely going to have what I think of as that space sci-fi setting, so I think that could be the one. I've got my fingers crossed, and I'll let you know how it goes. I'm only about 4 chapters into The Mars House, and already I think this is going to be a favourite, so I'm probably not going to check in with you again until I get to the end. And we are starting in a climate crisis London where the city is actually sinking under the water. We meet January, who is one of the principal dancers in the London Ballet Company, and he's at a stage in his life in his mid-30s where, as a professional high caliber dancer, he is starting to look down the barrel of retirement and what he's going to do with his life once he is no longer physically able to do what he loves. Fortunately or unfortunately, that decision is taken from him. The waves surge and the whole city finds itself flooded. Luckily for January, they are rescued and he's kind of presented with two choices. London is no longer livable. He can either go looking for asylum in one of the few countries, few cities that is managing the climate crisis, but he's told up front that getting asylum there is few and far between. Many of the borders are locked down. A better option for him is maybe to go off to the Mars colony, which is looking for workers. We then jump a little and see January settled on Tharsis, which is that Mars colony, and it turns out things aren't as idyllic there either as you might hope. Because January has come from Earth, his body is differently designed as opposed to the people who have been living on the Mars colony. They are in their 7th generation, so their bodies have adapted for Mars's atmosphere in a way that January's hasn't. He's what they call Earth strong. Basically that means he's a little bit shorter than the Mars natives, but more importantly he is stronger than them, about 3 times stronger. And these Mars strong immigrants have to wear special bodysuits when they go out so that they don't accidentally injure any of the natives who, from his point of view, are incredibly fragile. We see in his apartment block, we see in the city in general, that there's some tension between the two groups. It seems like these Mars strong people are looked down upon as being a bit rougher and as being dangerous, a threat to the native community. And I'm sure there is an immigrant narrative there, an immigrant metaphor that Pulley's making. I'll be interested to see how that feeds through the rest of the book. The moment I actually have only met January, this is a marriage of convenience type story as far as I know, and our second character, Aubrey, hasn't been introduced yet. Now, whether this is going to do your traditional romance, dual POV back and forth, I do not know. But I think it's been good that I've stuck with January for so long so far, because I really feel like I've got a really deep sense of him as a character. I've seen the destruction of his home city through his eyes. I've seen that moral dilemma he had about whether to stay or go. And now I'm getting to see Mars from the point of view of someone new to it, like me as a reader. And I'm getting a really good sense of the world building. If once we get into it we start flipping back and forth in the POV, that's fine, but I do think it's been good to feel really firmly grounded in January's point of view. This is by far the most sci-fi book I plan to read in this vlog. So as someone who said right at the outset that they weren't a big sci-fi reader, I'll be interested to see if this one might be the one that ends up being the 5-star read. I really thought I was going to love the Mars house. I'd heard that it had a fake dating trope, and that's always something that I really love. What's really interesting is that the book was nothing like what I expected it to be. It does have that arranged marriage, but I think in my head I had taken that trope to be something playful and fun, and it's something far different here. And yet I still definitely loved it. I will admit this is a slow book. It's one that it's taken me a lot longer to read than I think its page count I would have guesstimated before I started. It was a book that has a lot to say and a lot to take in, and I really wanted to kind of sit with that. So it took me longer. It definitely had a slower pace, and I do think it's a little slower to kick off, I guess. Up to around the 60% mark, I was enjoying myself. I was fairly confident this was a 4. And then while I can't point to an exact moment or an exact scene after that 60% mark, I just found myself really falling completely in love with it. There were some reveals that were pretty big twists, pretty big spoilers. Things though that I had been mulling over and ruminating. I don't know that I would have predicted the exact twist, but some of the elements that were the clues to it I had definitely picked up on. So I didn't feel like the twist came out of nowhere, like it was pulling the rug out from under you, which is what I like in a twist. I don't want to feel like there was no way I could have seen it coming. I want to think, oh, I saw that that was suspicious, but I just didn't put all the pieces together in exactly the right way. And I think Natasha Pulley has done that in this. It feels like an earned twist. It feels believable. It feels like you maybe would have seen the clues, you just didn't have all the information, and I think that really works. But it wasn't the twist that sold me either. I honestly can't tell you which element it was. It just all came together so well. The plot and the setting, the characters, the relationships and the themes, although I will say the relationship, as much as it's an arranged marriage, as much as there definitely is a romance here, calling it a romance would be misleading. That's by far the smallest part of the book. And it all just came together. And what I found really interesting is that January and the consul's politics line up a lot better than January and Gale's. And Natasha Pulley does a really good job, I think, of presenting both sides of the case. I found myself much more lining up with January, much more agreeing with his angle on the politics. It's to do with if we bring in the refugees that are coming from Earth, which is burning, flooding, drying up, there's a climate crisis. If we bring in the millions of Earth refugees to Tharsis, which is the Mars colony, then these people are going to be so much stronger. They're going to be Earth strong like January. And the point is that the native population are going to be vastly overwhelmed, both in numbers and in terms of physical ability. Gale sees this as something that will end Tharsis as it is. He sees it as something that will put the naturalised citizens in danger. There are already a really high number of accidental homicides every year just because the Earthstrongers can't control their strength in relation to the rest of the population. At the moment they're a minority, but what happens when they become the majority? So it's a really complex issue. It's one that there doesn't seem to be an easy solution to. There doesn't seem to be a technological solution waiting to save the day. This is something where a hard choice has to be made. I was on the side of you shouldn't be able to force people like January to naturalise, which is a horrific process that damages their bodies. You also shouldn't be able to leave these people that are fleeing a burning Earth and just kind of say that's not our problem. But Natasha Pulley does a really good job, I think, of presenting both sides of the problem. I never fully agreed with Gale's arguments, where he wanted to close the borders, or he wanted to force people that were Earth strong to naturalise, to become only as powerful or as physically strong as the rest of the population, even though it dramatically decreases their life expectancy. I never agreed with him, but I could see his arguments, and I think that's where she's threaded a really fine line. I think she's presented her case for each side in a compelling way, and also made it clear that for the majority of the book, you have to pick a side. There's no way that you can have it all. You're going to have to make a difficult choice. And that's very much the position January is put in, right in the middle. This book does some really good stuff with gender. We have Tharsis, this Mars colony, that has went past gender. They no longer have concepts of male and female because there's no real need for gender or sexual characteristics anymore. And so the Earthstrongers do maintain that gender. January is a he. We have other he, she Earthstrongers. But they are kind of seen as a little bit backwards for this, whereas the Tharsians are very gender neutral. They feel very offended if they are called Mr. or Mrs. or he or she. And so gender is quite a complex dynamic in the book. The only thing I thought was maybe missing in this, while it's a really interesting concept and you can tell Natasha Pulley has definitely put the thought into it, it kind of assumes that all Earthstrongers are very firmly in a he or she camp. And I felt like we didn't give any consideration to, would there be non-binary Earthstrongers who would come over? Maybe there are, it's just not relevant to January's story. I don't know how those people when they arrived would be seen, but it was something that I just thought was missing from the analysis, because it is an interesting concept, it's an interesting analysis. Are you right to cling to your ideas of male and female? How would a world that doesn't have male and female and doesn't have that difference in the strength between the sexes, how would that affect how society plays out. We also do a lot with language in this book. Aubrey is a linguist who is obsessed with the minutiae of language, and this is a colony that is now largely, I think, speaks Mandarin, but there's also a bit of Russian, a bit of English mixed in there. We have the discussion of words and phrases that we, as a modern reader, would use, but this 7 generations into a colony, things have lost their meaning, meanings have shifted, words have evolved, and I thought that was a lot of fun. We definitely had phrases that you could see the origin of and they made sense, but they weren't what you expected. And Aubrey's love of language really feels like the author has a love of language and translation, and that all comes through in the book and ties into both the communication and miscommunication between Aubrey and January. I think it's gonna definitely be a favourite of the year, one that I'm gonna reflect back on. And I definitely think this is the 5-star that I've been looking for this vlog, which is convenient since it's the last book I'll be reading. And also it's the most sci-fi of the sci-fi books. I know that the other two were, I want to say now with a little bit of space, were somewhere in the region of a very high 3 to a low 4 for 7 recipes, and maybe a low to a mid 4 for Mary Bennet. This one is definitely a 5 and definitely the most science fiction-y, which is surprising for me personally. I wasn't expecting the most science fiction book I picked to be my favourite. I was really expecting to struggle with whichever the spaciest book I picked was, but I do think the fact that this is Natasha Pulley does a lot of that work. I think her books are always different, and though there's always a speculative element, I don't feel that she returns to the same themes again, but what she always does do is that the last 25% of the book is nothing like what I anticipated. She always manages to have some kind of twist that doesn't just feel like a thriller or a mystery twist. There's always some really tied into the concept change that just shifts your whole perspective of the book, and I think that is something that I really enjoyed in this. The actual space elements, the colonization of Mars, the technology, I thought was really well described. None of it felt dry or way over my head. I will admit there's quite a lot about the linguistics and the technology for that. It was exactly at the level where I wanted it to be. If it had been any more technical, I don't think I would have enjoyed it. If it had been any less technical, I think it would have undersold the story. So overall, Sci-Fi Month has been a real success. All of the books I picked for this vlog have been successes. I wouldn't say there's any of the 3 books that I regret reading. The 7 Recipes for Revolution was maybe, I would say personally, more a sci-fantasy. It definitely, as a fantasy reader more than sci-fi, I thought that was the way I would have read it. But I suppose sci-fi readers might get something different from it. The alternate history with the Frankenstein angle was a lot of fun. I think it also helped that Frankenstein, the Netflix movie, just came out. I've always been a Frankenstein fan. It's my favourite classic, my favourite monster. I was always going to be kind of predisposed to enjoy that one. And then this book was one I've been anticipating all year. I very nearly read it roughly this time last year. I bought it and it's been on my shelf ever since. And I have been a bit intimidated about picking it up because I've been so convinced I'm going to enjoy it, and then what if I read it and don't? So it's kind of kept slipping down the TBR, and I'm really glad that I finally got to it because it did live up to my expectations. I really hope that you have enjoyed this vlog. I hope if you're a sci-fi reader, it's been fun. I hope if you're not a sci-fi reader, it's maybe given you an idea of what you might want to pick up for yourself. Let me know down below if any of these 3 books interested you, and let me know if there's any particular sci-fi that you recommend I try, ones that you think would fit my level of sci-fi enjoyment. If you don't have anything particular you want to say, then just leave me some kind of space themed emoji in the comments. As always, I really appreciate if you've got to this stage, if you want to like the video and subscribe to the channel to see more from me in the future. I have had a great time with this vlog. I hope you have too, and I hope that I'm going to see you in the next vlog. Goodbye.